What brought you to collecting, and especially Lincolniana?
Well, as a child, I was always interested in presidents and books about presidents. Growing up in northern Idaho, those figures were removed and they seemed to be distant days. But as I grew older, maintained an interest through college years in history and studied the law, I gravitated toward a career in politics. As a young politician, I was elected prosecuting attorney of my county. I one day got a call from a TV station saying that the Attorney General of Idaho has withdrawn from the race, endorsed you. Are you going to run? I put him on hold, thought for 30 seconds, picked up the phone and said, I'm in. And as a local candidate who was going to run for statewide office for the first time, I had to think of something to say to 35 different Lincoln Day banquet associations in the respective counties of Idaho. So I began to research the connection between Lincoln and so remote a place as Idaho and Idaho Territory. And I found, frankly, that he signed the bill creating Idaho Territory, appointed 15 of his early friends to come out and be our territorial officers, mentioned Idaho in the 1863 and 64 equivalent of the State of the Union addresses, and even on the last day of his life invited an Idaho governor to go to Ford's Theater with him that night to see Our American Cousin. So as I began to research those connections, I began to thirst for more and more Lincoln books, and that brought me, among other locales, to the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, where I was befriended by the then proprietor Ralph Newman, and he educated me on artifacts and how they tied into the Lincoln story, and I became an ardent collector at that point and have pursued it ever since.
How do you find artifacts tying into the Lincoln story?
Well, for me, possession of the objects is enjoyable. It's remarkable. It's been a worthy investment intellectually and fiscally, a lot better than some of my stock market investments. However, what I find most attractive about any particular object or book or signature is to understand the context in which it was created. If you have an object, in my opinion, in a modern day, you have a duty to understand the story about it and to pass that story as well as the object on.
What sort of objects do you collect? What sort of historical artifacts do you have in your collection, just as an example?
Well, knowing that there were a mere 15,000 to 17,000, depending on how you count them, Lincoln books, and knowing that a single object could be extremely pricey, even in 25-year-ago terms, I determined that it would be important to narrow one's collection sufficiently so that you could become both somewhat expert and enjoy the pursuit of those objects. I have tried to concentrate in Abraham Lincoln and the Rocky Mountain West, Abraham Lincoln the lawyer, Abraham Lincoln the politician, mirroring my own professional interests. And within that subset, I'm attracted both to early books and books related to those topics and mementos, memorabilia associated with Lincoln, his time, his family. And within that subset, I've been able to build a very good collection, perhaps the best collection, related to the Rocky Mountain West and Abraham Lincoln and his time.
As a collector, you have to have relations with others. What is your relationship with dealers, museums, other collectors perhaps, collecting clubs or subject clubs, other institutions? What as a collector, how do you have relationships with others in the world?
Well, in the Inland West, we don't have an organized Civil War roundtable. There are relatively few collectors as compared to other quadrants of the country. But the connections that one makes with reputable dealers, with other collectors, with people at the various academic and institutional organizations that put on an annual Lincoln or Civil War related connection have been absolutely fabulous. It's among the most rewarding parts of collecting, to build relationships with others that mature just as one's collection does over a period of decades. That's a fabulous part of collecting in this country.
Do you find when people look at your collection that they understand it, or are they awed, or do they understand that they're original? Well, how are the feelings of people who view it just in your everyday life?
Well, viewers come in all shapes, flavors, and sizes. Some have an innate interest in the most minute of details. Others want to simply tell you about something they know about something that may relate to something that may be accurate or may not be. But for the most part, when people can touch an object, sense an object, see an object in their immediate presence, it inflames their own interest in history. It stimulates some recollection they may have of some tale long ago told in the schoolroom. And for the most part, the marriage of modern day people and older artifacts is a very happy production for all involved.
How do you use your collection? Do you loan it for exhibits, for instance?
Well, I've used it in various ways, and I have the collector's ultimate exit planned for our material in Idaho. Over the years, I have decorated my law office with it, calculating that if people saw enough of Honest Abe on my walls, they must also presume that I'm an honest lawyer. We fooled a few people that way. I lent some of my material to a traveling exhibit that toured all around Idaho for 18 months or so during the Abraham Lincoln bicentennial era. And that exhibit was seen in about 30 different locations by between 300 and 400,000 people, which is an astounding number in a state that has a population of 1.5 million. And finally, we frequently give tours of my law office. When I give speeches on Lincoln, I usually take an object or 2 or 10 with me. I've been on the speaking circuit, for instance, with the Washington State Bar Association out of Seattle, and have regularly taken Lincoln Legals to seminars for lawyers that they've been conducting for the last year and a half. My exit strategy is the following. My wife, Nancy, says a guy can never have too much Lincoln. I believe her. However, part of the collector's obligation is also to figure out what to do with these materials once amassed and understood. I've made arrangements to donate the substantial portion of my collection to the Idaho Historical Society for an exhibit that will open as a museum gallery, a freestanding Lincoln Museum gallery in the Idaho History Center in 2013, which will be the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's creation of Idaho Territory. I'm excited about that possibility, better than a yard sale.
But you're not going to let go of your collection at this point. You're still collecting, you're still enjoying.
Oh, absolutely. I will place in that exhibit those items that have some sizzle value, some educational value, and I will attempt to demonstrate a thesis that I have urged upon the nation since 2009, namely that Idaho, more than any other state, is related to Abraham Lincoln. That made a lot of people in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois quite angry when we advanced that proposition. And in fact, it got some worldwide press because it seemed so outrageous. But with the kind of connections I've mentioned, there is some possibility of showing that Lincoln's connections with Idaho Territory were very intimate. I'll continue to collect, and I'll have subsets that I will continue to amass. I am not offended by the idea that some part of every collector's group of items and objects should continue to be in private hands and should be passed on to other collectors.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do you believe that one has an obligation to the next generation of collectors to leave some artifacts for them? Look at Oliver Barrett, for instance, and his catalog. And it's a thrill to say that one has an item now in one's own collection that belonged to the great Oliver Barrett. One might say the same thing sometime with the great David Leroy.
Or the not-so-great Dave Leroy. Nevertheless,
Is
yes,
there an obligation?
I think it is. I think the items that I will be giving to state institutional hands will be unique to that state and that institution, and will have some powerful connection to the people who will be viewing them in that museum setting. But many, many objects have a great Lincoln connection, and many of those, in my own self-interest, for retirement and for the wonderful experience of inflaming others to the collecting passion, I'll be delighted to pass to other collectors.
You certainly know more about your own collection and pieces in it than anyone else, or should. Do you do research on the items that you get, or some of them? Or do they need research? Do you think that you can evolve a story beyond what has been told to you when you purchase it, for instance?
Sure, and a collector should always gather as much provenance as they possibly can for buying even the most mundane of object, and certainly an expensive object or a unique object ought to come with a story. But validating that story before you buy it with whatever research you can do, and then enhancing that story with research after you acquire it, I think is part of the thrill of collecting. And it certainly is one of the great arguments for buying and amassing a wonderful collection of basic Lincoln books and Lincoln research and Lincoln books that have either a timeline or in some way relate to the uniqueness of a particular collectible.
Could you briefly describe a couple of artifacts that you have that you're emotionally attached to, that you think are interesting, not monetarily, it doesn't have to be a monetary thing, it can be
Sure.
something that you feel shows Lincoln or understanding of the era or has a great story attached, something that connects to you? Give me a couple of examples you might
Sure.
have.
Well, the first one I'd mention would be one of the most significant Lincoln collectibles I have in terms of uniqueness, and one of the first that I bought. It's a framed item. It's an albumen print of Lincoln done in carte de visite size. The Lincoln $5 bill portrait that was used to engrave the image on the old $5 bill. But below that is mounted one of Lincoln's little White House cards. Dated in 1863. It's directed to the Secretary of Interior, signed by Lincoln, A. Lincoln, in his customary hand. It says, "Secretary of the Interior, please see Mr. Tuckerman about colonization." That, when I found it at a Seattle book fair, astounded me, because here, available for acquisition in private hands, is a note, perhaps the only one available in the private endeavor, talking about Lincoln's most controversial prospect of encouraging the shipment of blacks back abroad after the Civil War had been won. A plan that was rooted in his relations and fondness for Henry Clay back in the 1840s, a plan that may or may not have disappeared during his White House years, depending on who you talk to. And I thought then, and I still think now, that was an amazing find and a great acquisition that fueled my enthusiasm to continue to collect. One of my more recent and very, I think, important collectibles, and one about which I wrote a book, in fact, was one of the inscribed copies of the Lincoln-Douglas debates given to a man named Dyer in my case. I began to research whether that would be worth a significant price when it came up at a New York auction house. If you recall, I had you bid that in, and we were successful at buying it at a very advantageous price. And it, at the time, according to Harry Pratt, the former Illinois state historian who researched those books in the 1950s, was one of 18 known copies of the Lincoln-Douglas debates inscribed by the candidate himself. That Pratt article, together with the acquisition of the book, caused me to use modern research methods, including the records of this bookshop, and it proved the unconventional adage that it's easier now to research Lincoln than it ever has been in any time during his life or since, because by a combination of looking at auction records, internet records, book documentaries, I was able to find, again with your help, a total of 42 copies of the Lincoln-Douglas debates inscribed by Lincoln. more than doubling Pratt, the Illinois State Historian's number, and he was at the center of the Lincoln world 50 years ago.
So, as a collector, you found the internet to be a boon.
Yes, it can also be a bust if you acquire something too hastily without researching
on the
it.
internet as a
Certainly.
collector?
But it's equally possible, if you're precise about what you're doing on the internet, to know something more, a great deal more often, than a dealer or a person who is selling something, and buy a true rare gem at the price of a very modest offering.
As a collector, is there something that, the collectors really define themselves not with what they have, but what they have missed? Is there something that you've missed that you wish you had grabbed at the time?
Well, that's a good question. Because I specialized so narrowly, and because I have tried to collect judiciously, standing on the shoulders of experts like you who can tell me when this is a truly worthy piece at a very favorable price, I've had far more hits than misses. I can't think of anything right now that I lose sleep over. But by the same token, I can tell you that I could not today afford to amass a collection in terms of market value that I have bought piece by piece over the years. So if something really speaks to you and the price is affordable, even with a little stretch, it's not a bad thing to do. For instance, in the case of the inscribed Lincoln-Douglas debates, I didn't happen to have tens of thousands of dollars available to put down on the auction block when we successfully won that. But I arranged with my banker to take out a little second mortgage on my law office. That being done, arguably, that's one of the most significant investments I've ever made, because the last one of those Lincoln-Douglas debates at auction sold for $185,000 last year, including buyer's premium. I paid less than a sixth of that.
And that's during an economic depression. Let me ask you then, let's go to your, well, first of all, let me ask you about collectors. Is there any advice that you would give to a collector today, Lincoln or otherwise, just as a collector?
Well, I think the exciting thing about today is that a collector who has a good idea can instantly be connected with sources of material to begin that collection, to inform that collection, to price that collection. One byproduct of the kinds of TV shows, Roadshow and the Pickers and all of those sorts of things, including the Las Vegas pawn shop, is that we're all instant experts these days on what is and what is not genuine, what is and what is valuable, what condition means in a particular object, and we all may have some rudimentary idea of what prices are worth in some area of interest to us. I guess my advice to collectors would be to study the field, survey an overview before you begin, and have some kind of focus. It's far more fun to know more and more about less and less than it is to know less about more.
We can cut this out of the tape, I presume.
Sure, yeah.
Do you want to change? I think at this point I'd like to get to this.
No, what I would recommend is if you want to ask Dave about the book, go ahead and ask him with the current shot, and we'll go ahead and have him answer. And then when we're done with that, we will pose. Dave will pose with the book and with the statue, and then I can put that over the voice recording as though the voice recording were a
You want me to give him this to hold as I ask him about it? Here is your book that...
Only if you want to
sure.
show the book itself.
Let's shamelessly hawk it.
Sure. But I mean, we'll have a very good looking, when we're done with the interview, we'll have a very good looking, just posed.
Would you rather have than an artifact to show?
We're going to add that. Yeah, I think.
You want that instead of the book right now?
No, I think I want to. I want to get the best possible shot of Dave talking about the book right now.
Okay.
But if you decide you want to pick up the book and show it, then I'll get it.
Yeah, Dan can hand it to me at some point.
Sure.
Here, so.
Sure.
Dave, you feel that there are educational and scholarly aspects to collecting, because you've gone out and produced a book based on one of your artifacts that you have that has inspired you to learn more. And as a collector, you have taught the rest of us about Mr. Lincoln's book. The only book that he really authored, we now know, through you and the numbers that he did. Tell us about the scholarly aspect, the educational aspect of being a collector, and how it brought you to that book.
Well, part of my thesis, as I've explained earlier, is that the collector has an obligation to understand the context of an object, the time in which it was created, how it interacted with others around it, what it represented, what it may have done. And interestingly enough, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, I theorize in my book, was the book that elected Lincoln president. It went into printing of 50,000 copies, which was a runaway bestseller in that day. It was printed at 6 different locations, and Lincoln carried all of the states in which it was published. And it was read as books were in those days, not just by one person who acquired it, but everybody in that household, the people down the block, and somebody across the way as well, across the farm fields. That book, encapsulating Lincoln's ideas, in effect became his surrogate campaign. He didn't give campaign speeches. He didn't ask her questions. When people would inquire of his views in the 1860 race, he would say and write, "See my published remarks." So my theory is that Lincoln's scrapbook, which became a published book, was the only book that he ever wrote, making him an author, and it was the book that elected him president. To understand all of that and to find twice as many copies as the Illinois State historian found that had been inscribed by Lincoln was a remarkable intellectual journey. It's been fun to interact with Lincoln groups and Lincoln study specialists and Lincoln collectors all around the country. When a question comes up or someone thinks they've discovered a new Lincoln inscribed volume, I'll get an email, I'll get a telephone call. And so to become the spokesperson for Lincoln and the Lincoln-Douglas debates at this late age is not only a fascinating intellectual endeavor, it's a wonderful social endeavor. And luckily, we've almost sold out of the books.
Well, collecting is a social endeavor, and because we all are part of that same collecting world, whether we're curators in museums or auctioneers or dealers like myself, or just merely a collector who actually makes the rest of it all go around. And so, Dave Leroy, appreciate very much that you're on Artifact Whisperer, and that you will come back again, I hope, and we'll do this again. But I think it's been most edifying for all collectors to hear what you have to say. Thank you for being with us.
Dan, it's an honor to be with you, as always.